Welcome to this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast, the first for 2021. I'm your host, Lev Gringaus. Normally, I have a solid podcasty intro with music and a quick paragraph on the news that's covered, but this time it felt a little inappropriate to have that, because what I want to talk about is the storming of the Capitol of the United States of America on January 6th. It's taken me a while to figure out what to say. First of all, this is a podcast about Jewish news, not about political news overall. Second of all, there's so much new reporting coming out every day about what happened that it's just overwhelming to sort through. And of course, there's the natural anxiety of a 23-year-old wondering why anyone should listen to what I have to say. But I'm going to try and do here what I normally aim to do on this podcast: give a big picture view with a Jewish perspective, specifically with a reflection on how we Jews, being the canary in the coal mine, served as the warning bell for the domestic terrorism that we saw. Obviously, a lot of this podcast will sound somewhat redundant, but bear with me, and if you want a more personal perspective on what happened, TC Jewfolk editor Lonnie Goldsmith interviewed Jewish Minnesota Representative Dean Phillips on his experience when the Capitol was overrun, and a link to that story is in the podcast notes. So let's start with just a recap. On Wednesday, January 6th, as Congress was in the process of certifying the Electoral College vote and giving a final confirmation that Joe Biden was elected to be the next president, there was a rally held near the Capitol building. At that rally, President Trump and other members of the Republican Party reiterated the lie that the 2020 presidential election was rigged and stolen from Trump. They said this to thousands of Trump supporters and told the crowd to head to the Capitol to fight against this alleged rigging. Many of these Trump supporters showed up in gas masks and riot helmets, with police-grade zip ties, with guns, with pepper spray, and even with climbing equipment. And that detail is according to the now former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund, who resigned after the Capitol was overrun. Over the course of the day, pipe bombs were found at the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee headquarters. One man even parked a pickup truck full of homemade pipe bombs near the Capitol. In this group, they held all manner of flags: MAGA flags, American flags, Don't Tread on Me Tea Party flags, Confederate flags, Blue Lives Matter flags. There were also others, including the occasional Israeli flag. And so, armed and ready, directly after the rally, this crowd, this mob, went to the Capitol and overran it. They broke windows, climbed over walls. Vice President Mike Pence and the House and Senate members and their staff were evacuated, or they hid, barricading themselves in. The process of certifying the Electoral College vote, literally a cornerstone of the democratic process in this country, was disrupted. In this mob were all manner of people, including off-duty police officers and former members of the military, neo-Nazis who were also at the 2017 Charlottesville, Virginia Unite the Right rally, and a man in a Camp Auschwitz sweater. So far, 7 people have died as a result of the Capitol being stormed. 3 of the Trump supporters had as yet unexplained medical emergencies. One Trump supporter, trying to force her way onto the floor of the House of Representatives, was shot in the neck by Capitol Police and later died. One Capitol Police officer, himself a Trump supporter, was beaten by the crowd, allegedly with a fire extinguisher, and later died of his wounds. Another Capitol Police officer died by suicide 3 days later, and a Trump supporter in Georgia killed himself after being charged for breaking into the Capitol. So maybe the big question a lot of people are asking themselves is, who could have seen this domestic terrorism coming? Well, here's where I want to really back up and connect the dots, because in a very real way, we, the Jews, or at the very least some Jews, saw this coming. And I think revisiting that is key to really nailing down how we got here. There's a certain conversation Jews like to have about themselves. We're the canary in the coal mine. When a country is veering into dangerous territory, that danger happens to us first and is visible through us first. Part of that is the general reality of being a minority. We're not necessarily the only canary in a coal mine. And part of that is the uniqueness of being Jewish and the many manifestations of anti-Semitism. Back in 2016, the mainstreaming of white supremacists and neo-Nazis was already visible. Jewish journalists reported on it. Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, experts in researching and tracking extremism and hate were already writing about it. The link between what President Trump and other members of the Republican Party were saying and how white supremacists were acting was already being talked about, though not quite being taken seriously by the general public. In 2017, we had the neo-Nazi Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where white supremacists chanted, "Jews will not replace us." Again, there was a conversation about this link that these neo-Nazis were marching because of Trump and were inspired by Trump, and many said so themselves, but maybe it didn't seem fair to blame a new president for neo-Nazis, and it's not like Trump had spoken at the Unite the Right rally. So again, as a country, we moved on. In 2018, a white supremacist convinced that Jews were orchestrating a mass immigration of Muslims into the United States in order to overwhelm and wipe out the white race, murdered 11 Jews in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. This white supremacist's concern about immigration and the rhetoric he used in social media posts echoed the rhetoric of President Trump and many in the Republican Party on immigration. Many Jews were incensed seeing this link between the hysterics around immigration and the worst terror attack against American Jews in this country. But Trump didn't actively say Jews were trying to wipe out the white race by helping immigration, and Israeli officials like then diaspora minister Naftali Bennett insisted that Trump was the greatest friend Jews had ever had, and it's not like Trump himself talked about immigration to this white supremacist. It was just one crazy guy, so we moved on. And then another white supremacist in 2019 attacked a synagogue in Poway, California, murdering another Jew. That guy was inspired by a neo-Nazi terror attack in New Zealand, where an Australian neo-Nazi murdered 51 Muslims across 2 mosques. In a twist this time around, the Poway shooter spoke against Trump in his manifesto because Trump likes Israel. Extremism experts warned, though, that white supremacists had developed a strong international community, egged on by inflammatory rhetoric like that used by Trump. For example, how Trump regularly called immigration or refugees an invasion. Curiously, the Australian neo-Nazi in his manifesto called Trump a new white supremacist hero. And over the course of Trump's term in office, in congressional hearing after hearing after hearing, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security said that the biggest terrorism threat was no longer from ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it was from white domestic terrorists. And to be clear, what I've listed here were not the only white supremacist attacks in the United States or in the world, far from it. I'm just focusing on Jews here as this is a Jewish podcast. The point here is, we were the canary in the coal mine. We've seen this country get more and more dangerous, and crucially, how it has gotten more dangerous. And the Jews who were dismissed as the sensationalist doomsayers for pointing this out over the past few years were right. The storming of the Capitol wasn't done in a day. It wasn't even done in the several weeks post-2020 election when Trump and many in the Republican Party insisted the election was stolen and that their base needed to fight to win it back for Trump. This has been a years-long development of speech having power and that power chipping away at American democracy by lifting up and inspiring and mainstreaming the extremist elements we saw on January 6th. And now we saw it directly. That's kind of the amazing thing to me with what happened at the Capitol. Trump and Republican Party members spoke to a crowd of supporters, and then those supporters went directly to the Capitol to overrun it. Direct link. No amount of backpedaling after the fact can erase that link. No statements, no speeches, no videos, nothing. And all of this, to point out the obvious, is a threat to this country and American democracy, and it's a threat to the Jews. While the storming of the Capitol wasn't about Jews explicitly, it's worth noting that eventually every conspiracy theory involves us. Who helped the Democrats allegedly steal the election? Eventually, it's George Soros, notable rich Jew. The ADL has a page on their website about how some prominent white supremacists think that Jews paid for Antifa to dress up as Trump supporters and overrun the Capitol to make Trump look bad. A link to that is in the podcast notes. In a broader sense, any political instability means more danger to Jews because anti-Semitism thrives in instability as people try to find scapegoats for their insecurities and anxieties. And in a very specific way, again, white supremacists have been mainstreamed over the past several years, fed rhetoric and grievance and legitimacy by elected officials, and that is also a threat to the Jews. A couple of things to note here. Yeah, danger to us comes from across the political and ideological spectrum. Orthodox Jews in the New York City area have been usually attacked not by white supremacists, but by Black and Hispanic people. The terror attack in December of 2019 at a kosher grocery store in New Jersey was done by people associated with a radical sect of Black Hebrew Israelites, not white supremacists. And yes, there were also Jews supporting Trump who stormed the Capitol. Ivanka Trump, in a now-deleted tweet, called the rioters, quote, American patriots. But the President of the United States of America has not been empowering Black Hebrew Israelites. They did not storm the Capitol and parade around with Confederate flags. They did not attack American democracy. And I don't say this to negate other threats, but to make clear why we focus on the gravity of this threat. And speaking of the Confederacy, there were Jews who served that traitorous entity, so we can both identify a threat and recognize that there will always be some Jews who are fine with that threat, if not entirely supportive of it. The bigger picture is the same. We saw incitement happen directly on January 6th, the same kind of incitement that less directly has been plaguing American Jews for years now. And maybe that immediacy, along with, the Capitol being overrun by domestic terrorists, is what finally got the notoriously nonpartisan Anti-Defamation League, one of the leading organizations on extremism and hate both inside and outside of the Jewish community, to break with tradition. On January 8th, the ADL called for the president to be impeached, in a statement linked in the podcast notes. The ADL is the only mainstream nonpartisan Jewish organization to have done so, and it's a little too late for anyone else to jump in the ring because, as of the writing and recording of this podcast, the House of Representatives already voted to impeach Trump. So now we see how being the canary in the coal mine has ended up. And I want to leave off on one last bit of reflection related to this. The Jewish community has prided itself on becoming a bipartisan issue and making Jewish communal priorities like Israel a bipartisan issue, from local Jewish community relations councils to the Jewish Federations of North America to the American Jewish Committee to AIPAC. Partly this is a matter of smart politics. You don't want to leave your cause in the dust when power changes hands. And partly this is also a matter of deep Jewish anxiety. At a certain point on a communal level, we want to be American. We want to appeal to everybody, have friends on all sides. We don't want to make any enemies. We don't want to be isolated because when we are entirely all American, we are safe. And this makes it hard to step up and say when a political party is engaging in behavior that is dangerous to us. Lots of Jewish organizations have called out President Trump specifically for inciting the riot at the Capitol. And I'm glad they're naming names, but if you're going to be accurate, name names. President Trump is not the only person who spread the lie that the election was stolen and told his base to fight and get it back. Republican senators like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Lindsey Graham did so. Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy did so. This is just systemic in the Republican Party, and it's not partisan or political to say that. Unfortunately, it's just the truth. And they've created a monster they can't control, as Vice President Mike Pence, eternally loyal to Trump, was hiding in the basement as the Capitol was being overrun, These Trump supporters and domestic terrorists were in the hallways chanting, quote, "Hang Mike Pence." Trump and his supporters were convinced Pence, as the vice president, had the authority to negate the electoral vote and claim the election for Trump. He had no such legal power, but they threatened him anyway. Senator Lindsey Graham, a prominent Trump ally, denounced the president and the rioters when Congress reconvened to finish the electoral vote count. Later at the airport, he was harassed by a mob of Trump supporters. And there are several reports, one of which is linked in the podcast notes, that many Republican members of Congress now fear for their safety and the safety of their families if they don't follow the Trump agenda. So even after the Capitol was stormed, on the lie that the election was stolen, more than 130 Republican members of the House of Representatives still voted to challenge the results of the election. Wednesday's impeachment vote in the House had a record 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment, and yet only 10. If that isn't terrorism, literally striking fear into elected officials to get them to vote a certain way, I don't know what is. Without rejecting that monster that has enveloped the Republican Party, without distinctly pointing out what has gone wrong here, it will continue to be, and grow as, a threat to this country and to the Jewish community. There can be no unity or healing without accountability, or else we were the canary in the coal mine for nothing. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.